Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar hosted by the International Dyslexia Association of Massachusetts. Our topic tonight is Dyslexia 101, kind of the foundation of dyslexia, what it is, how it presents itself, and how you can help people who have dyslexia. My name is Dina Masikwa. I am the president of the International Dyslexia Association for the Massachusetts branch. I am a special education consultant working with families, parents, helping them navigate the special education system. And I also work with schools with regards to early literacy instruction in the gen ed classroom. I am licensed as an Orton Gillingham practitioner, and I am so glad to be here tonight to host this webinar. And I will let my co-presenter present herself. So Angie, you can go ahead.
Hi there, I'm Angela Eyre, and I don't see myself, Dina, but for now it doesn't matter. We'll worry about that after when I'm actually speaking, doing my part of the presentation.
Sorry about that.
No worries. Dina and I are trying to get some of the technical things. We're very glad to be here tonight. And just briefly, I am a speech language pathologist and literacy specialist, and I have experience in several different settings. Right now, I'm in private practice, and I work with children, adolescents, and adults who have challenges in language and literacy or related executive functions. And I'm happy to be here tonight, and I'll hand it back to Dina.
One thing I want to say before we get started is in late May, early June, we will be hosting another webinar on neuropsychological evaluations, outside neuropsychological evaluations, so outside of school testing, and the webinar will also include in-school evaluations. So how to interpret these evaluations, which can be so helpful as a parent because it is such a minefield and there's so much terminology. So please be on the lookout for that upcoming webinar in late May, early June. Okay, so for tonight, due to the short time that we have, and we have quite a large topic, which is dyslexia, we will not be doing a Q&A session this evening at the end of our presentation or during our presentation. However, please, 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 if you have questions, feel free to email us at the address which is listed here, which is our IDA Massachusetts branch email address. And we will definitely try to get back to you as soon as possible with answers to your questions. And I will also give this email address at the end. So for today, I just want to start briefly with who are we? So what is IDA's mission? IDA's mission is to create a future for every individual who struggles with dyslexia and other related reading differences that results in a richer, more robust life and the access to tools and resources when they need them. So that is our mission. We're a nonprofit organization, and we try to really share resources, give presentations in the field of dyslexia and structured literacy, which we will be talking a little bit more tonight. So for tonight's agenda, we're going to start with what are some of the common myths about dyslexia. Then we'll talk about what is dyslexia, what are signs of dyslexia, what are characteristics of good intervention of dyslexia, and what supports are helpful to people with dyslexia. So let's start with some of the myths. One of the most common things I know when I talk with parents and individuals about what is dyslexia is this notion that people with dyslexia see letters backwards. That's actually not true. Dyslexia is not a visual processing issue. If one has dyslexia, you can sometimes see letters backwards, letter reversals, but it's definitely not a visual processing issue. Dyslexia is neurobiological, which means it's brain-based, and we're going to talk a little bit about this more later. Dyslexia impacts how your brain processes language. A second myth is that people with dyslexia are not smart. That's actually not true. Most people with dyslexia have average or above average intelligence and cognitive abilities. Dyslexia is not caused by a lack of motivation or interest in reading. The lack of motivation or interest in reading can be a consequence of dyslexia, because reading is very taxing and can be very difficult for people with dyslexia. Another myth, which I commonly hear, is that you outgrow dyslexia. Oh, well, you outgrow it, you'll get over it. You don't outgrow dyslexia. There's no cure for it because it's not a disease. It's brain-based. And the good news is that with proper intervention, you can actually rewire the brain so that your brain is able to use the parts that it needs to use efficiently to read. Another myth is that dyslexia occurs mostly in boys. Current research has shown us that dyslexia actually occurs quite equally in girls and boys. One of the reasons why a lot of people think that dyslexia occurs mostly in boys is because when boys are experiencing, not all boys, but because of how we're socialized in terms of difference between girls and boys, when boys experience difficulty in school, they're more likely to act out, and it shows up in their behavior, whereas girls may try to hide their trouble and sort of like sit properly and have been sort of trained to look like everything's fine. And so the boys get diagnosed for behavior issues, and then they might get a special education evaluation, and it turns out that they do have dyslexia. And that sort of falsely inflates the statistics. Another myth is that girls will never learn, sorry, not girls, people with dyslexia will never learn to read well. Most dyslexics do learn to read and can very much enjoy reading, and once they have the tools needed to be able to read, can have a very rich, fulfilling life with regards to literacy skills. The last myth is that people with dyslexia cannot learn more than one language. That's actually not true. With the right instruction, the right type of instruction, people with dyslexia can learn more than one language. What's key is how that language is taught to that individual. So let's now move on to dyslexia truths. What is dyslexia? So dyslexia is a language difference. It's not a visual perceptual difference. We've said that. Dyslexia occurs in people of all levels of intelligence and all levels of intellectual ability, even people who are intellectually gifted can have dyslexia. It occurs in all kinds of families, regardless of socioeconomic status. That's very important to remember. So even if a child is in a family where they're read to and they're surrounded by literacy, that child can still have dyslexia. Another important thing is that many students who have dyslexia may have some other what we call coexisting condition, including other learning disabilities, or social emotional difficulties that co-occur. So in 30% of students with dyslexia, you're also going to see ADD or ADHD. That's a very common occurrence. It can be in a mild form or a stronger form of ADD or ADHD, but it's in about 30 to 40% of students, you will see that, or people, sorry. Another truth about dyslexia is that children who respond poorly to typical classroom instruction may be dyslexic, It's not that the student isn't smart. It's not that the teacher isn't a good teacher. It's just that the instruction might not be the right kind of instruction to meet that student's needs. With the right kind of instruction, that student can definitely learn how to become a strong reader and speller. And another truth about dyslexia is that with the right instruction, right type of instruction, a student with dyslexia can definitely learn a second language. So now we've talked about sort of what are the common myths of dyslexia. Let's move on to what is dyslexia. So what you see here is a diagram of, there's a larger circle, which is what we call the learning disability circle. What is a learning disability? And you'll see that at the very, center of that circle, the smaller circle, you have dyslexia. And between those, you have what we call a language-based learning disability. So let's start with the big circle. What is a learning disability? A learning disability is a term for lots of disorders that relate to skills needed to learn and are caused by a central nervous dysfunction rather than by another disability, such as an attention problem or a socioeconomic factor. So based on this, there are lots of different kinds of learning disabilities, including ones related to listening, speaking, writing, reasoning, math abilities, social skills, and reading. Within the umbrella of learning disabilities, you have something called a language-based learning disability. And what is that? It's a disability that impacts a student's ability to learn, to talk, understand, or use any aspect of language, right? So if a child has difficulty with receptive language skills, which is understanding what they're being told or taking in what they read, or expressive language skills, which is expressing your thoughts clearly, that is a kind of language-based learning disability. A language-based learning disability can also include struggles with reading and writing, and that's where dyslexia comes in. What's a little confusing is that there are many different terms used to mean dyslexia. Dyslexia can be referred to as a specific learning disability, a communication disorder, a communication disability, a language disorder, a learning disability, a language-based learning disability. People use these terms interchangeably. What I want you to know, and if you're a parent with a child in a school who is on an IEP, or who you're concerned about whether your child needs additional services and should be on an IEP, the important part is not to get hung up on, does the school use the term dyslexia? Okay. In Massachusetts, on an IEP, you will see the term specific learning disability, SLD. Dyslexia falls under that term. So if you see that term, that's what the school, that's where the dyslexia falls under. The important part is, what are the services that the child is getting? Are they getting the services that addresses their needs in reading and writing? That's the important part, not to get too hung up on, oh my gosh, are they using the term dyslexia or not in the IEP? Just putting in the word dyslexia in the IEP does not guarantee that the student will get their needs met. I wanted to say that because I have a lot of parents that ask me that question regarding IEPs and whether or not the term dyslexia is in there. So now let's go on to looking a little bit more into what is dyslexia. Here's a writing sample that was written by a 12-year-old girl, and I just want to read it to you. I'm a 12-year-old girl, and for 12 years, I have been dyslexic. That means when someone has some trouble reading and you know what, I read this earlier today and I knew what she was trying to say, and then I've lost it. I'll come back to that word. Some people, what is it, Angie?
concentrating.
Thank you. Have reading and concentrating. Thank you, Angie. Some people think someone who has this disease is stupid or unable to do things for themselves. But I'm dyslexic and I can talk, walk, do my homework, dance, help other people, and those are things that anyone can do. All it means is that I have a little trouble reading and I learn slower. So what do you notice about this writing sample? One, she can express herself well, clarity of her writing, and you notice difficulty with spelling and some of the grammar and syntax. So this is very indicative that students who are extremely bright can struggle with their spelling and their reading and their writing. And it doesn't have anything to do with intelligence and the ability to express oneself with clarity. So now let's get into what is dyslexia in terms of the brain. We said that dyslexia is neurological in origin. So what we see here is on the left-hand side, you see a typical brain. There are 3 areas that have been highlighted in red. And here's what happens. When a person reads a word, this is in a non-dyslexic brain, the information comes at the back of the brain. So the back of the brain is the small red area on the bottom right-hand part of the brain. That is what we call the occipital lobe, and it's the visual processing center. So they see the word. Then the visual processing gets mapped onto this middle red area, which is the auditory processing center. So let's say the word is, they see C-A-T, they go on to, oh, that's k-at, cat. And then that information goes to the frontal part of the brain, which is more the frontal cortex, which is semantics, which is where you make sense of what the word is. Oh, what's a cat? Oh, I know what a cat looks like. Okay, I have that word in my word bank. So there are 3 things happening: auditory, visual, to word meaning. In a dyslexic brain, what MRI's research has shown us is that the part that gets the most activated, that's mainly activated, is the semantic area, is the word meaning. You're not getting the activation of the visual part and of the auditory part as efficiently. So what happens is that the brain is working really hard to try to make sense of what's on the page, and these parts of the brain are not getting activated the way they should be. What's incredible, what we see is that with proper intervention, the brain is plastic, and those areas, the visual and the auditory, do get activated over time with proper intervention, and the brain develops an efficient system for reading. So we said that dyslexia is a specific learning disability, which we talked about, is neurobiological in origin. We just said that, it's in the brain, characterized by difficulties with one or more aspects of reading. I'm going to talk about that in a sec. These difficulties are often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. Again, it's not that it's a bad teacher. It's not that the child comes from poor socioeconomic background. It has to do with, it's really brain-based, and it's unexpected in terms of sort of the more outside conditions. So let's go on to one thing that's really important that I want to say is that one of the secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension. If a child is struggling to read, they're going to struggle with understanding what they're reading because they're just trying to get words off the page. That's where their energy is going. And they're not able to like make sense of what they're reading because they're just trying to understand what the word says. Another secondary consequence is reduced reading experiences can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. So this is really important. If a child struggles to read, they're not going to want to read. Through reading, we gain a lot of vocabulary and we gain background knowledge. If a child doesn't want to read because it's hard, their vocabulary is not going to increase as much as for a child who loves to read. and their background knowledge might not increase as much. So you get this Matthew effect, which is called the richer get richer, the poor get poorer. The child who likes to read reads more and more and more, the vocabulary increases. The child who struggles to read, their vocabulary and their background knowledge starts to decrease. So the sooner we can help children who struggle with reading, the better. So what are some of the difficulties in reading that we notice? And I'm going to go through each of these arrows one at a time. So one of the things that is very important that you actually notice in very young children is something we call phonemic awareness, perceiving sounds in words. What does that mean? So if I give you the word cat, repeat, cat, and now say cat without the k, what are you left with? At. What I just asked you to do, you could do it. You didn't need to know how to read. You could have been in a room with lights out in the dark. You basically were able to take the word cat, isolate the sounds, k, at. You took away the k. You were left with at. You blended it at, and you said to me at. That is called phonemic awareness. Phonemic awareness just means ability to manipulate sounds and words, perceive the sounds and manipulate them. Being able to put sounds together, k, at, put it together, you get cat. In pre-K, and often in before kids get to kindergarten, you can do those kinds of activities with students, and you can see what is their awareness of sounds. If a child struggles with that, with phonemic awareness, they're going to most likely struggle with reading. Phonemic awareness has been shown to be one of the most solid predictors of ability to read later on when kids get to first and second and third grade. So phonemic awareness is extremely important, and there's a lot of tools and exercises you can do to help students with phonemic awareness. And I just want to say one thing. Why is phonemic awareness important? Because if I asked you to spell the word cat and you go k, at, you just broke down the sounds, and that helped you spell the word. So that's where phonemic awareness connects with spelling and reading. Now, another area of reading that you will see sometimes children with dyslexia struggle with, or most likely actually, is what we call phonics. Phonics is basically the next step, which is after phonemic awareness, we have a sound. What's the letter that makes that sound? C or K. So there you have the letter sound correspondence, which is often worked on in pre-K, in kindergarten. They're doing a lot of works with phonics. And it basically has to do with sounding out words. So if I see the word bat, I go b, at, bat, right? So I have my code, letter sound. I know my B says b, A says at, T says t. Okay, I've got the code. So that's really important in terms of working with students with dyslexia to teach them the code. Approximately 84% of the English words are regular for reading if you understand the structure of language. So it's really important that children are taught the code of language and are not just taught to memorize what words look like, but really taught the sound symbol correspondence and taught all the patterns and have these tools in their toolkit so they don't have to guess at what words look like when they're trying to read. We don't want any guessing. So another characteristic of students with dyslexia is that they often struggle with accurate and fast word reading, which is fluency. So eventually you want to move from this step-by-step act to looking at the word cat and you recognize it. It's like orthographic, what we call orthographic mapping. You have that word in your word bank, and which allows you to read much more efficiently. Fluency is really important for comprehension because if a student is constantly spending all their time trying to decode each letter, all their energy is going towards that, and they're not going to be able to spend their time comprehending what they're reading. So eventually you want students to read fluently so that their energy, their mental energy, can go towards reading comprehension. So here I'm going to show you a diagram. Actually, not a diagram. You're going to see, this is an example of how the patterns we hold in our heads, what I just talked about, orthographic mapping, is really important. If you look at here, the H and the H in the first, the H and the A are exactly the same symbol. Because now our brains figure out that because of the surrounding letters, oh, there's a T before the H and there's an E after the H. Oh, that word must mean the. That's because you have the word the in your orthographic memory. Same for cat. Because you see the C before the A and the T after the A, you're like, oh, that must be an A. It says cat. Readers need to be able to find patterns and symbols when we're reading. We have to be able to have these words in our bank so that we can quickly recognize these words. Here is another example of how reading fluency is so important. So if I give you a few minutes, try to read this to yourself. Just try to read this, take a moment and see if you can read this. And I just want to tell you one thing, is that the person's name is Og. Okay, now I'm going to pause. You might not have had a chance to look at all of this, but what I want you to know is that this says to use Og's method of illustration, early Greek writing, as well as all other early as well as all other early writing, looked something like this to its readers. When a student with dyslexia is not a fluent reader, this is what a page can look like to them, a string of letters. So what's key is that you want children to have orthographic memory of the words and of the patterns so that it isn't a string of letters. They're able to see the word chunks and get them off the page quickly and efficiently. So another area that you can see students struggle with who have dyslexia is what we call memory for sounds, or phonological working memory. So what does this mean? Basically, what it means is that if I give you the word cat and I ask you to spell the word cat, you're able to hold in memory the word cat and you go k-at, cat. You were able to hold that word in your memory. Students who have, now I'll give an example for reading. Let's say the word is Thumbelina, and the student is trying to decode it and they're going Thumbelina. They get to the end, they've already forgotten what was at the beginning of the word. So that is what we call poor phonological memory. And I just gave you two examples of why it's so important to have a strong memory for sounds, holding these phonemes in your mind, because it helps you with reading and with writing. And again, there are lots of tools that can be used to help students develop strong phonological memory. So the last area that I want to talk about, and then I'm going to pass it on to Angie, is spelling. Students who have dyslexia often really struggle with spelling. We've talked a lot about reading, and I want to talk a little bit more in depth about spelling. So spelling and decoding, which is reading, are two sides of the same coin. Basically, they both rely on these underlying what we call phonological awareness skills, or sound skills that we were talking about. And spelling reflects how the code of print reflects onto spoken language. Because if you say the word cat, the student has to be able to go k-at, break it down to spoken language, and then spell, go from the sound to the symbol. Spelling develops in a very typical, predictable sequence. So you can teach spelling in a very predictable way. It does not need to be based on memory. A child does not need to remember how to spell words. And that does not work for students with dyslexia. There is a code, there are tools, and that's what we need to give them. Spelling is more challenging than reading, than decoding, as it heavily taxes your retrieval and your working memory, because you have to hold the word, you have to break the word down, and then you have to spell it. So one thing that's important to remember is that what is a good speller versus a struggling speller. Somebody with strong spelling skills will have strong phonemic awareness, can store and recall letter and letter sequences, which is what we were talking about, that phonological memory piece. They will write with more precision, detail, use more complex words, and have good orthographic memory. They develop these patterns for words, like the word the, which is a sight word. They know, oh, that's the. Or even the word bat, they're like, oh, I've got it, instead of sounding it out every time. A struggling speller will have a decreased sound system knowledge. They have a decreased flow, as lower level skills are not automated. That phonological awareness is not automatic. And they rely much more on simpler words in their writing. And they may have weaker orthographic memory, which is those patterns we were talking about. So we're about halfway through our presentation, and I am now going to pass it to Angie, who is going to talk to you about what are the signs of dyslexia. And I'm going to stop my video, and so that Angie, you have the floor.
Awesome. Okay. All right, so we're going to keep going on with signs of dyslexia. And by now, after you've learned what some of the signs are, then of course, let me just make sure I'm on the right spot. Okay.
Sorry, I'm sharing the wrong thing. So sorry about that.
It's okay. Do you want me to share my screen? I'm happy to share my screen.
Back. So sorry about that. Okay. We're back.
Okay. All right, so we're going to start off with Katie, and she is a 4.5-year-old, and she loves to go to school. She likes to swim and dance and draw, and she loves listening to stories. She's very social, and she likes to play with her friends, but Katie's least favorite part of her school day is when they have to work with letters. So for preschool kids like Katie, some of the early warning signs are listed here, and I'm going to go through them. But first, it's important to know that children with dyslexia, they may exhibit some of these. They might exhibit all of these symptoms, or they might not have any of these difficulties as preschoolers. So these are just some red flags to be looking out for. They're not all necessary to have dyslexia. So an important warning or red flag would be if a child is late in learning to talk or has difficulty learning new words. It can also show up in articulation, where they're having trouble with that processing of sounds, and it means that they're not pronouncing words in the way that you would expect or the way that other people around them are. It can be trouble naming letters, and it can also be some of those early developing phonological awareness skills that kids are going to be having trouble with. So rhyming is a big one to start with. They can also have trouble figuring out that first sound in words when they're just listening to words, no print involved. If they have been exposed to letters, then they might find them confusing, and it's difficult to remember any sounds that they've been taught that go with the letters. And so they might start avoiding them and feel like Katie, where it's just difficult, and they don't want to be working with letters because of that difficulty. So then if we go on to Eric, Eric is a kindergartner. He's 5.5, and he always has loved school, but this year his parents are noticing that he's complaining a lot about going, and when they try to read together, he just seems really frustrated. So in kindergarten and first grade, noticeable warning signs might be continued difficulty with those phonemic awareness tasks. And at this age, we'd be expecting kids to be able to take apart the sounds and manipulate them more and put the sounds together in words. Um, uh, and then if they're having trouble with those kinds of phonological awareness tasks, they might also be having trouble figuring out or learning the phonics concepts. So that's where they actually are trying to pair the letters and the sounds that they make and learn the patterns for phonics. That can be difficult. Can also show up in that kind of orthographic memory, the memory for patterns of letters. So those high frequency words that you are expecting kids to have seen so often that they just know them by looking at them and they don't have to work to decode them. And some of them might be some of those irregular words that they need to learn by sight. But even though they've been taught that, they're still having difficulty remembering them, or it's effortful to read those words. And it can show up in writing too, with poor spelling or poor handwriting, difficulty forming the letters. Okay. So by second and third grade, children have had more exposure to literacy instruction, and often there are three main areas of difficulty that can be red flags or warnings that there's a possible reading disability. So it's continued difficulty with more of the same as they're advancing, trouble recalling those sight words even after they've been taught or they've practiced. They don't have the memory for those patterns. Also difficulty with phonics skills, so trouble matching the sounds to the letters and figuring out those patterns. And of course, it can show up in spelling, where sometimes kids are omitting sounds, they're not hearing the sounds, so they're not perceiving the sounds, so they're not figuring out a way to try and represent that sound when they spell. And they might have trouble remembering those associations. Okay, I hear k, but I don't remember how to spell that. I don't know what letter to write. And then it can also be difficulty remembering how to spell even the most common kind of little words that you would expect kids have written so many times that they would remember how to do it. But that can be an area of difficulty. And of course, some other things that you might see in second and third grade are inaccurate and slow oral reading. And because they're having trouble figuring out what the words say, they're working really hard to figure out the words, to sound them out or try and figure out what those words say. They're not really able to gain meaning from the text. They're having trouble comprehending or getting the message, which is the whole point of reading, because of those word reading difficulties. It can also show up in written expression, which can be poor handwriting or difficulties with getting your message out in print. And of course, this can continue to lead to avoiding reading and writing, something that can happen at any stage. Okay. And as you may know or have experienced or witnessed, by the time children are in third grade, that's really a transition year. At this point in most schools or most classrooms, the expectation is that now kids have learned how to read. So now we're going to switch to using reading as a way to learn. So the kinds of texts that you are given have fewer pictures, they are much denser. There is not as many context clues, or where kids are having, they're being exposed to words that they might not hear in spoken conversation. So it's harder to try and figure out what the vocabulary means. And of course, there's a lot more independence that's expected at this point. And so At this point, kids may be struggling more with some of the home assignments or keeping up with assignments in school and may need more support. Okay, so in the upper elementary grades or kind of early middle school, kind of 4th to 6th, difficulties might be especially apparent in writing. And this is a 4th grade writing sample. And as I read, try to follow along with the handwritten text so that you can see some of the characteristics that Dinan just talked about. So like poor memory for really simple words like was, they're omitting some sounds when they spell. They are having difficulty using the right symbol to represent the right sound for words that are phonetically regular. They're omitting past tense endings or not using the right orthographic pattern. They're just trying to sound it out instead of including that past tense. So even if the child might say the past tense, they don't represent it in print. It's just getting omitted. And especially those longer words, that difficulty holding all of the sounds in memory and kind of parsing it out can show up in some creative spelling. All right. And the last thing is that you'll kind of see that it's a somewhat fragmented narrative, that there's so much energy going into just getting the words on the page that the sentences don't really hang together well. All right, so I'll just read it quickly. So I was perfectly happy disintegrating in the dark. I heard a scraping, then a snap. Sunlight flooded in. Ben picked me up in a pile of leaves. I jumped out. He caught me. I was stuck. Ben showed me to his family. I was flattered from all the ahs and oohs. I got bagged, boxed, and put in the freezer for 5 months. So lots of ideas there, but the spelling and some of the other conventions of written language are not getting down on the page. Okay. So then in terms of reading, it's going to be kind of more of the same, just difficulty keeping up and performing at the level you would expect for their age or grade, considering the amount of instruction they may have had. So that might really show up when kids are expected to read fluently. And a lot of schools monitor progress or kind of keep track by giving oral reading fluency tests. So some kids may be reading just at a greatly reduced rate, partly because they're not facile with figuring out or recognizing the phonics patterns and knowing words by sight. So you're going to see inaccurate reading of real words. And we also give nonsense words only to see if kids can figure out the phonics patterns. So if they're having trouble reading nonsense words, that tells us that they don't know the phonics patterns to be able to decode. And of course, avoiding reading because it's difficult is always going to be a sign. Especially at this age when there has been that transition to reading to learn, comprehension is going to be reduced when they're reading because it's just not as an efficient way to get information as listening. So they may understand when a teacher explains something, but if they had to read the same text, then it would be really reduced because their energy is going into figuring out the words. And as we just saw, poor spelling and written expression, and possibly also handwriting difficulties. Okay. So in middle school, it's kind of just, you can kind of almost feel it snowballing on. There's still going to be slow and laborious reading. Students can really feel overwhelmed by the amount of work that's there. And because reading is so laborious and takes so much time, there can be a feeling that it's really difficult to get through things fast enough to be able to cope. And there just hasn't been a chance to really develop effective strategies for studying. Again, kind of some of that energy is going into just figuring out what the words say. And written work sometimes is kind of the last thing to be addressed and remains a big problem. So at this point, especially, instruction is always important, but accommodations and modifications might also be important, particularly at this stage, to help kids make it fair so that they can have the same ability to access curriculums. All right. And by the teenage years, it's similar to what you would see in middle school. One thing that might come into play more often in high school is expectations to study a foreign language, which, as Dinan already mentioned, it's certainly possible to learn a second language and to learn to read and write in a second language. But it really depends on how that language is taught. And so a student with dyslexia may really struggle in a traditional class that isn't using the kind of multisensory structured ways that they benefit from. So sometimes students can get a waiver of any kinds of foreign language. Sometimes people can substitute a class on culture, which, you know, in our world today, where it's increasingly global and multilingual, can be really important to have that opportunity to learn about another culture and learn about another language. And of course, many individuals with dyslexia can also be bilingual and hoping to increase their literacy skills in a second language. And that's certainly something that can happen. And the last thing I'll say about that is that if students do want to study a foreign language, one recommendation is to choose a language that is more phonetically regular, like Spanish. There are fewer patterns to learn. So something that's more regular with phonics can help kids have an easier road in learning a second language. And of course, having that remedial instruction as well as the accommodations is really crucial for developing literacy skills. And adults, you're going to see the same types of difficulties. It often really shows up in just needing so much time and effort to get through reading and writing tasks. There's that lack of fluency, can feel exhausted because reading is so effortful. There can be difficulty with multiple choice tasks on testing because it's so much information to process. And in a workplace setting, it might show up as really poor performance on kind of rote clerical tasks that involve literacy skills. But I really want to emphasize that that even as an adult, it's still possible to learn how to read, and remediation can be really effective. And there are also accommodations that some workplaces are willing to provide. So it's still important and possible to find both ways to improve your skills and ways to cope or be supported. And as we saw in almost every age and stage, sometimes difficulties with reading and writing really cause people to avoid reading and writing. Instead, they're really relying on other sources of information that they can hear by listening or talking to friends, or if there's a way to get it visually. And sometimes just this feeling of not being able to access what everyone around you is accessing can really contribute to a maladaptive, kind of hostile or resistance to school, which makes sense. It can also lead to being depressed or antisocial. So it's really important that that if you are seeing some of these maladaptive coping strategies, that that they, as well as the basic skills or remediation, that they're getting support for developing coping strategies, which can be emotional support or other kinds of therapies, but it can also be some of those accommodations like using technology. And Just because of the time today, we won't go into the details about what happens in an evaluation or a screening, but you should be familiar with the difference. It's never too late to request screening or evaluation. And for children in a typical public school, screening happens in general education classes. And you may have heard that recently the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education released guidelines for screening after some legislation was passed, thanks to some great advocacy in 2018. So there is an expectation that students will be screened because it's possible to identify struggling readers earlier and earlier. So the purpose of a reading screening is just to figure out what is the next step. Is this a student who might receive some instruction in a small group, which is often called response to intervention? Or if a student is still struggling, even with that extra support, or if they're showing very severe difficulties, they may be referred for a more comprehensive evaluation to determine whether they're eligible for special education supports. So if they do have an evaluation, whether it's through the school setting or with outside testing with a neuropsychologist or a team of people, including speech language pathologists and literacy specialists, then it would be, a lot of formal testing that involves standardized measures, and it's going to really be comprehensive and look at all different kinds of skills. And unfortunately, there's a lot of promising research. At this point, we can't really give you a test and say, yes, you have dyslexia because this is what's happening in your brain. It is kind of a complicated process of looking at lots of different characteristics. Okay, so if you do end up realizing that, yes, I have dyslexia, or I have the enough of the difficulties that are associated with dyslexia that I could benefit from special instruction, then it's important to know what is effective for people with dyslexia. So structured literacy is definitely the best practice, and it's kind of a newer term that we're using to describe effective instruction. And the first aspect of it is that it's very systematic. There is a plan that's going to teach all of the different patterns for phonics. And it's also that those patterns are going to be taught in a sequence that makes sense. And of course, it's going to be very multisensory. You're going to learn through listening and working on that phonological awareness piece, or the and speaking. You're going to actually be pronouncing the words and figuring out those sounds and talking about what you read, actually doing the reading and actually writing. So it's going to be using all of those different senses. You can also use tactile or other kinds of senses to help with memory. And a really important part of it is that it's very explicit. The rules and the concepts and the structure of the language is explained, and the patterns are taught. It's not left up to the student to infer what's going on or guess. It's very explicit of this is the pattern, and this is how you know what sound to use or what letter to use. Okay, and it's cumulative, so there's a lot of chance to spiral back to things that you've learned and keep practicing until you have had a chance to really become automatic and master those concepts. So new concepts are still introduced, but there's still a cycling back and review, and the learning builds on each other. Of course, if you are participating in intervention, or your child is receiving intervention, it's or if you're providing intervention, it's really important to continually monitor that progress so that you can design the instruction in response to what the student needs. All right, so I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to kind of speed up a little bit. But one important aspect of instruction is to make sure that it's the right intensity. So it's usually going to be more than once a day or more than once a week, and it's going to be individualized. So depending on the program, there are many different structured literacy programs. Orton Gillingham is kind of the grandmother of a lot of them. But the recommendations for the intensity may vary depending on the program. It can vary from usually at least 1 hour daily, 5 days a week, or and up to as much as 4 hours a day or 5 days a week. The delivery of the instruction also matters. For individuals with dyslexia, having a homogeneous group where people are working on similar skills and they're at the same level, there's not a wide gap between what they're focusing on, is most effective. And if people have very severe difficulties, then one-to-one instruction is going to be even more effective so that it can really be customized and they can have that chance to review and gain mastery of the skills. Which brings us to, of course, intervention is a huge support for people with dyslexia, but we'll mention some other ways that people with dyslexia can be supported. So the first is, if you suspect a reading problem, seek testing. Seek testing for your child, seek testing for yourself, seek testing for anyone else in your family who you think has a reading problem, because that's the first step in figuring out what is happening and how to get help. If a diagnosis of dyslexia is given, then really seek information to understand what it is, and for children, help them understand what it means to have dyslexia in terms of some of the things that we've talked about tonight, and letting them know that they are not alone. And the way you talk to a child in preschool is going to be different than the way you would talk to a middle schooler. So kind of giving information in a way that people can absorb it. Advocating is huge, and helping people, especially kids, develop that self-advocacy that they will need as an adult, because sometimes people can develop that learned helplessness, and we want people to be able to advocate for what they need and know that they deserve it. And being part of a community can always help so you're not feeling that you're alone, meeting other kids or other adults with dyslexia and having a support network of families or people who have had similar experiences, in addition to your network of service providers or educators. The last point is just really being able to balance the need for improving skills with living a balanced life and having a chance to be a child, and finding those areas where you can really put your passions and excellence into work. So it's not all just about struggling with reading and writing. Here we have a list of kind of strengths or challenges that you might see. Of course, people are more than just reading and writing. So if there are areas of difficulty, it can be important to get support to address these areas of difficulty. Or if they are strengths, you really want to help encourage the development of those skills so that it can be an area to shine. And these, of course, there's lots and lots of people in the world with dyslexia who have accomplished great things. This is just a sampling of a few famous people. And that's all we have for tonight. So thank you for coming. I'm going to pass it over to Dinan to.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Angie. for sharing that second part of our presentation. So I just want to say to everybody, thank you so much for attending tonight. Unfortunately, due to the length of this topic, we don't have time for Q&A, but please email us your questions at the email address listed on the screen, and we will do our best to get back to you. And again, we will be having another webinar in late May, beginning June, on evaluations, both outside private neuropsychological evaluations and on school evaluations. And we will also talk about speech and language evaluations, and it will be about how to understand these evaluations, which can be very overwhelming. So thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you for being part of the IDA community. And we wish you well, and feel free to reach out with any questions. Good night.